Hi, all, and welcome to the first inaugural podcast for this channel. This channel is going to do a podcast on the 1800s up to World War I in Europe. And right now we have special guest Evan Loganov or Loganov?
Loganov.
Loganov, okay.
I've had Loganov pronounced all the time, but it's Loganov.
Loganov. And I'm Patrick Richardson, and this is Remembering Truth. I want to talk first and foremost to start off the 1800s with a very important figure in the way I think about society and also history, especially, is Napoleon Bonaparte, who you doubtless we're all familiar with. Now, Napoleon is kind of likened to a Julius Caesar type figure, but in point of fact, his conquests were radically undermined as soon as he lost power. And Joan of Arc conquered more land for France than Napoleon Bonaparte did effectively. We can talk about colonies in Africa, Egypt, Algeria, although Algeria wasn't necessarily a Napoleonic effort. But by and large, Napoleon's efforts were more in his, not so much his political accomplishments, but more in his legal accomplishments with the Napoleonic Code, and also his upgrades to the military and the method of warfare that was, re-standardized by his effort. We could talk forever about Napoleon. So I want to say a few things that I think are neglected when people hear or talk about Napoleon. One of those things is that he made most of his time he was fighting the Austrians. That was kind of like the big, pie in the sky for Napoleon, was defeating the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg monarchy. And the other groups kind of came in later or were in intermittently, and then they kind of went out and came back. But for Napoleon, for him to conquer Europe, he had to face the Austrians, defeat their monarchy, and then after that, he had to, show up the Prussian military. I think Spain and Russia were seen as secondary to Prussia and Austria, and he did accomplish that. But then after he took everything over, but then he made a mistake. He installed his family, very old school style, into different areas. The Kingdom of Naples, Spain, the Confederation of the Rhine, which he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. He effectively defeat the Habsburg monarchy permanently, and made them an irrelevant influence in the European theater. But he tried to be, his own version of the Habsburg monarchy, the Bonaparte monarchy. And although he had his, his control for a while, he neglected the fact that the British had a vast naval empire that could, based on foreign colonies, that was basically endless source of revenue for them. And they could just blockade any port. And so, by the time his continental system was set up, he was losing tons and tons of money because all the ports in Europe were being blockaded by the British. And eventually, he was defeated by at Leipzig with the Battle of the Nations. And after that, he just and then obviously that was even today the Battle of the Nations has the largest monument, war monument in all of Europe. It's at Leipzig. And people talk about Waterloo as the main defeat, but I think the Battle of the Nations is by far the more important battle. You had the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, the Swedes, and everyone facing against Napoleon, and his groups of people, some German, some Polish, some Italian. But fundamentally, all of Europe came together to defeat the Bonaparte at this one battle, and it crushed his movement for forever. He had his 100 days where he came back and, he mismanaged his generals, and he tried to do a Waterloo and he failed. And historians look at that and they're like, yeah, Napoleon wasn't in shape and he was past his prime. He didn't know what he was doing. It was almost like he wanted to fail at Waterloo. So I think Waterloo is a false flag. I think the real battle that defeated Napoleon was Leipzig. And then, of course, shortly after all that, all his generals get executed. And then you have Metternich and Talleyrand meeting at the Congress of Vienna. So even though the Austrian monarchy is overthrown, not overthrown, sorry, it's dissolved. The HRE, Holy Roman Empire, is dissolved. The monarchy is reduced in prestige significantly. Even though this is happening, there's a change of tactic in politics where diplomacy starts to matter far more than actual, absolutist energy and absolutist efforts. And I think Evan has something to say about the Congress of Vienna.
Yeah, Congress of Vienna, in some ways, is even more important to European history than what Napoleon did. Oh, a lot of what Napoleon did when he took over these countries is he put in place more liberal constitutions that guaranteed things like separation of church and state and I guess some degree of rights for the people. At the Congress of Vienna, they were mostly reversed. I mean, they were put in kind of reactionary regimes and kind of restored the old regime in many ways. But the seeds had been planted, and that's basically when we get to 1848, basically, that's when a lot of this comes to a head, that weren't going to tolerate these kind of regimes like Metternich and others before. I mean, and there was a lot of strife in most of these countries afterwards. I mean, one of the few that avoided the strife is Britain. I mean, they did have things like the Cato Street conspiracy that tried to overthrow the regime, but mostly they avoided a lot of this stuff. But after Napoleon, the map was reshaped in a way not so much to kind of destroy the great powers, but a lot of smaller city-states were kind of absorbed into the greater map that had existed before then. There were also areas that were partitioned, like Poland was partitioned between Russia, Austria, and Prussia. And Italy still remained divided until at least we get to Garibaldi. So that was one area that had little change. Another area was under the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks actually revolted against the Ottoman Empire, and that was a big kind of some cause celeb within Europe for supporting the Greeks. It was ultimately a success, and Greece was established as an independent nation for the first time in centuries after being under the Ottomans. But after Napoleon, most of the countries did remain relatively the same as they were before Napoleon. But like I said, that would soon change. There were also so yeah, that's basically the idea with the Congress of Vienna. I'd like you to take it off.
No, I think the Congress of Vienna was fascinating because you had Alexander the First of the Russian Empire, and you had and he was the rival to Napoleon because he was also an emperor that was far enough away, I guess, for Napoleon to respect him and see him as like sort of someone to duke it out with. And famously, Napoleon did that whole campaign in Russia where he stormed all the way to Moscow and burned it down and had a battle and won. And then it was a Pyrrhic victory. His entire army was destroyed. And he literally was like at his wit's end trying to get out of there. And he almost got ambushed on several occasions. And if you call it, like, there's arguments that it wasn't even a victory because of how costly it was for Napoleon. But I guess like on the battlefield, it technically was, right? And then, but what's funny is that Napoleon had this like relationship with Alexander the First, and Alexander the First lived a long time, and he really at the Congress of Vienna kind of led it. He was sort of the leading monarch in that whole context. So he really had a lot of authority not only as a member of this Congress, but as a monarch that had real power. And Napoleon had a shifting view of him. At one point he thought that his happiest moment was when he was feted and treated well by Alexander the First at his when he established his continental system, and he was awarded by the Pope and all these dignitaries for uniting all of Europe. But at the other times, he doesn't like Alexander the First, and he calls him a shifty Byzantine because he's Greek Orthodox. and it's like this like religious thing he insults him on. So the fickleness of Napoleon, it starts to show in his writings when he's in St. Helena. And this matters because you realize that Napoleon wasn't meant to be like the emperor of Europe. He was too judgy. He wasn't a serious intellectual. He was only smart when he needed to be in terms of gaining power and control. He wasn't smart in terms of someone who could mastermind an effective system that could unify Europe diplomatically. Now, the people of the Congress of Vienna, they could do this. This is what their life's effort was to do. Napoleon was a judgmental person. These people were a little too smart to be judgmental. And you had Talleyrand on the French side. You had Metternich on the Austrian side. And you had Alexander I on the Russian side. And this is the interesting thing, is that at this point, people still had high hopes that Metternich would kind of lead the whole thing and bring Austria back to prominence and be sort of because we don't talk about it a lot, but Austria was famous at this point for defending against the Turkish invasions in the Great Turkish War, which happened about 100 years prior to this, plus 120 years. And so they were known for being sort of like the defenders of the faith of Christendom and keeping the infidel, Sunni Turk Muslims out, the Ottomans, right? And so they had this reputation as defenders, but those days were long gone. And soon after the Congress of Vienna, everything that Austria was trying to do sort of fell apart a little. And, England was really a country that had to take over for that, the decline. France could sort of coast with its new regime, but then because Waterloo was so famous, what's his name? Duke Wellington, right? Alfred Lord Wesley. He became Prime Minister of England, and he rode on the coattails of his military success quite a bit. And so England really became a very, very prominent country in Europe after the defeat of Napoleon. And Austria started to dwindle just because its military tradition was falling apart. Later on, we'll see Prussia unify into Germany. You'll see southern Italy get conquered by Garibaldi, northern Italy conquered by a few others. That unifies into Italy. These two new countries emerge. You see the emergence of Belgium being carved out of the Netherlands. And obviously, as you mentioned, Greece and some countries like Serbia will emerge also. I think the efforts of Talleyrand to maintain this sort of restoration of the monarchy at the Congress of Vienna, while at the same time insisting that they're not going to be imperialistic, was very, very intelligent. And I don't think anyone could have pulled it off except for him. Evan, do you have anything to say on this?
Yeah. Okay, so in the aftermath, they did restore the Bourbon dynasty. They did that with Louis XVIII. This was kind of thing, because in some way Napoleon was an authoritarian. I mean, he did centralize power a lot, but in other ways he was a liberal. I mean, he enforced separation of church and state. He had some sort of rights for his citizens. He emancipated Jews in that other way. And the one that basically Louis XVIII was, he was kind of trying to restore the Ancien regime, which was beforehand. And of course, in the immediate aftermath, the French people were basically tired. They didn't want to do any sort of revolt. But that was, I mean, his days were numbered from the beginning. And that's when the July Revolution came. Basically, one of the things he did to try to avoid it was he invaded Algeria to try to kind of stir up national pride, because he knew his popularity was quickly waning at home. But I mean, it was only a matter of time, and he was overthrown, and a monarchy was.
This was the July Revolution of 1830.
July Revolution.
1830, correct?
A monarchy was put in place, but it was more of a constitutional monarchy. It was by Charles X. So that's what happened in France. I mean, another thing happened was in Spain. It wasn't so much in Spain, but in the colonies. which is where you have Spain was already a weak European power relative at that point. Ever since the 30 Years' War, they'd kind of been declining, but they still kept a vast sort of overseas empire in the Americas. But after, the Peninsular Campaign and Napoleon, it became very hard to basically maintain that. And someone named Simon Bolivar came around and basically led a revolution of all these countries, and they lost virtually all their colonial empire in just one fell sweep.
Yeah, I believe Jose Marti was the other guy, right? So, of those two, that was a famous pair, of revolutionaries. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's basically kind of the nail in the coffin of the Spanish Empire. I mean, for all intents and purposes.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And a point on Spain was that for the Spanish, that they barely had resistance to even to Napoleon, and there's a reason for it. Was that before Napoleon, and back in the 1700s, they had several wars against France, the Spanish, and they teamed up with the Austrians in some instances. In other instances, they fought against the Austrians, even though they had family ties. And eventually, the Spanish people got tired of the Habsburgs running their country because they were these Austrians, right? They were foreign; they weren't from Spain. And this goes back hundreds of years, and eventually they actually wanted the Bourbons of France to run Spain. But the implication of that was that the entire empire would be run by the Bourbons, and so when you can see where it's going. The Bourbons literally restructured the entire colonial system for the Spanish Empire, took away a lot of the religious element to it, and took away power from the priests and the bishops and so on, the missionaries, and made it more of a military style regime where it was very militaristic and there was a lot more slavery, and it became kind of ugly, the Spanish Empire. And that was part of its decline, was because of how grim it became and how unsavory it was to live compared to the older days of when it was newer. And so, obviously, by the time of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, Spain had just its empires were just deplorable to live under, just really harsh conditions. As far as the July Revolution, it's so unfortunate how in this time for France, there's all this tumult because they have this legacy of revolution now after the French Revolution, and they can't keep a figurehead. Eventually Napoleon's, great nephew of Napoleon. Exactly. He was called Louis David Napoleon, I believe. And then he took over, and then he called himself Napoleon III. And there was never a Napoleon II, right? They had Louis XVIII, but they didn't have a Napoleon II. But he takes over and he calls himself Napoleon III. And then he runs France for a while. And
we shouldn't get to this point. This is kind of later.
Yes.
We're going to 1848, so.
But I bring it up just to show you how ridiculous the French the vicissitudes that France is going through. You look at other places, they're forming countries. Countries are forming, but France is it's changing figureheads constantly, and it's very hectic. And the fact that they bring back a Napoleon type figure later in the 1800s is a demonstration of how confused they are as in terms of their leadership. But I think the interesting countries in the once we get into the 1840s is probably Germany is most interesting. Also Poland. These countries, there's a sweep of revolutions going around through Europe. A lot of them are it's all about helping the people, raise the status of common people, individual rights. In some cases, you're seeing serfdom being abolished. In other cases, you're seeing, voting rights.
I'm going to elaborate more on the serfdom part.
Okay. Okay. I'll let you. Let me say one thing. Let me say one thing though. Yeah. And then you see this interesting irony in Poland, where the Polish in the 1840s they don't want any more Jews in living there, and they have a kingdom right after 1815. They actually have a small kingdom, and they're also been partitioned, but they have a kingdom, and there's it's a very confusing situation for them. But the fact of the matter is that they wanted to kick out the Jews in Poland, and literally the Germans had to tell them not to do that, and had to convince them to keep the Jews in Poland. Sorry, and so yeah, but please go on.
Okay, so serfdom in most of the Western European countries, or pretty much all of them, was abolished centuries before. But many places in Eastern Europe, it was not abolished. In fact, went on for a long time after that. The most prominent example was Russia. And there are multiple factors behind its abolition. One was kind of the bottom-up one. I mean, this is probably, given the regime, that's probably the less significant, is that, the kind of liberalization, at least, kind of from the French Revolution, had some peripheral effect in even places like Russia, which were pretty absolutist. Another probably greater effect was that the economy was modernizing, and for a lot of landlords there, that serfdom was just not practical, because when you had a serf, that means there's no labor mobility. You basically had to care for them forever. You couldn't really change your operations on what you do. So it was kind of, a lot of the landlords started to see it more as a burden than as a gift. And so they kind of, those two factors, a lot of the places in Eastern Europe kind of pushed for the abolition of serfdom. In Russia, it happened in the 1860s, and other places it happened a little earlier. But that was probably one of the most major social changes in Eastern Europe at the time.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is the Ottomans, countries like Serbia, they got these Balkan countries. They were liberated briefly, and then they get recaptured by the Ottomans, in a matter of years, right? And of course, fortunately, Greece was excluded from that. Greece was able to get its independence for good, and the one thing that we can observe about the Greek condition under the Ottoman hegemony and control was that they really devoted themselves to the Orthodox Christian, scholarship and monasticism. They really devoted themselves to developing that church into having a refined tradition, because they were so limited in their cultural expression by the Ottomans that religion was the only thing they could turn to. So despite all the drudgery of being ruled by tyrants, the Greeks were able to improve upon something in their culture that's very overlooked.
Well, yeah, and the Ottomans were very much weakened by that time.
They were known as the sick man of Europe, and at this point, they were fighting against Russia in the Crimean War. And believe it or not, the English and the French allied with the Turks against the Russians, which still surprises me. But the thing is that the Crimean War, a lot of people talk about the American Civil War as having all these interesting innovations in warfare, like medical or artillery innovations. Actually, most of those innovations happened in the Crimean War. Crimean War is a very innovative time for the conduct of warfare.
Well, yeah, we'll get to that later in other works. But another thing that is pretty coincidental about about the 1800s was the improvement in agriculture. So there was a philosopher named Thomas Malthus. His basic premise was that basically the population would reach a certain point, and then due to the limits of agriculture, there would be basically mass death. They just wouldn't be able to advance further, and would in fact basically just a lot of people would starve. That actually did not end up happening, in the exact opposite. Agriculture improved dramatically, and then the population started booming across Europe. You saw greater urbanization, and that was kind of commensurate with early industrialization in a lot of these areas. But I think that's one thing that's often overlooked, the kind of improvements in agriculture at the time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And obviously sometimes some of the agricultural stuff was still bad. I mean, there's a reliance on potatoes in Ireland that eventually would become very, very bad. And there would be a blight all over Europe in about 49 or so. And so
particularly bad in Ireland.
But nothing that, nothing great anywhere, right? Bad for everyone. And the other thing was that the culture in Europe at this point was at a high watermark. I mean, you have Beethoven, Johann Goethe. You have Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, who was literally looking at the world that Napoleon had sort of created and talking about the zeitgeist that was being embodied by that, and all the passionate chivalry that was being transformed into a mechanical age rather than one based.
Romanticism.
Yeah, romanticism, exactly. All these romantic philosophers, poets, Schiller, Schelling, even. You have all these great, and a lot of these guys are German, but you also have people who aren't German. You have William Blake, who was a pre-romantic poet, philosophers of a kind, painter, printmaker, and you have the this legacy also that Mozart brought in, but the Romantics really carried. And you also you have the other composers like. All these famous people were in this time period. I don't know their exact days of birth and death, but to name a few, and to keep in mind, most of them died in their 30s. But to name a few, you have Franz Liszt, you have Chopin, you have Schubert, Franz Schubert. You have eventually you'll get Wagner and Tchaikovsky. That's far later, but they were alive in this period, learning things. And I think the most famous individual you can really name in this 1830s, 1840s period is Karl Marx. Maybe Friedrich Engels goes with that, but Karl Marx.
He didn't become Karl Marx. He was very influential in history, but during his lifetime, he actually was not that famous. He was kind of obscure.
Yes, but he was so extremely.
In the 1840s.
Yeah, he wasn't a celebrity. And he was always poor, always borrowing money from people, to the point that it's actually embarrassing. And he was he liked to party. He was he's kind of a spendthrift, really, despite being a middle class person. He was very spendthrift.
Yeah, that's kind of socialist movements did gain popularity, especially in the early years of industrialization, like around 1848 and beyond. But Karl Marx was not the central figure. There are others like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon or Peter Kropotkin or
Karl Marx wasn't a socialist.
Who actually were more influential than Marx.
Oh, and Marx was that's a great point. And also Marx wasn't a socialist. He was his own animal. He was a new Hegelian, right? He was a communist. He viewed everything in terms of Hegelian terms, whereas the socialists.
The difference between him and the other socialist philosophers, which probably is one of the reasons he became so influential, at least later, was the other philosophers kind of were just saying what ought to be, what ought to be the good system. What Marx said was basically that his system was inevitable just by the laws of history. I mean,
he's very much influenced by George Hegel, who was if you're like history, if you're someone who likes history and philosophy, Hegel is kind of the main cat because he kind of combines both.
Because Hegel was not more. Marx was a materialist, and Hegel was more of
an idealist. Yeah, and actually, Hegel would probably disagree with Marx on a number of things.
Yeah, he was religious. I mean, at least nominally. I mean.
Oh yeah, and then of course in this period you have, speaking of Hegel, you have one of his rivals, I suppose, is Arthur Schopenhauer, and then you have also in terms of philosophy, you have Auguste Comte, who invented positivism. Very influential person, and also helped define sociology. And some of my favorite people are the utopianists from this period, who had these funny ideas about how to construct utopia. It's sort of aligned with the socialism of later, but it was more of a capitalistic kind of version of that. And then I think,
let's get on to the industrialization.
But so do you? And then my favorite philosopher from this period. And I know we're talking quite a bit about philosophy right now. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but is the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham, and that's someone you should check out. He's a very quixotic, funny writer, a lot of oddball ideas, but also a very smart person. He was a jurist, a social reformer as well as a philosopher, and he is the founder of modern utilitarianism. But yeah, in terms of industrialization, go for it.
Three main big factors. One was the railways, which mostly in Britain at that time, but they were revolutionary, and they allowed basically people and goods to travel in a quicker period of time. It would take a lot longer for most other countries to get established railways, but they definitely did. Others were textiles. They they occurred both in Britain and in like the Low Countries of the Belgium and the Netherlands. They're kind of creating clothes that would allow for a lot easier than would be earlier. And another one was basically the use of coal and iron, because those two things allowed, first of all, ships to be built that were more durable, and other materials that could be used in warfare is one thing, and just general buildings. So that was, industrialization was the biggest in Britain, I mean, by far, but it definitely would go to France and a bunch of other places in the later decades, and that's kind of, I mean, I'm not going to get to World War I, but basically World War I was by the point where basically all of them had been industrialized, and that basically that was inevitable for this kind of.
It was uniform at that point, yeah. And you know, Germany is also seen as the premier industrial power. But at this,
it surpassed Britain at some point, but it didn't start before Britain. Britain started first.
Yeah, Britain was the first, and Britain. There's an interesting theory about that, where because Britain never had a revolution, they were able to give money. They were able to focus on capitalism and focus on, you know, like landlords and power. The
enclosure movement, basically, like kicking the tenants off of large parts of land because they were no longer needed to farm, and then using modern farming techniques. And then these people would go for jobs in the cities, like especially like Manchester and areas like that became very industrialized.
Urbanization is part of it. It goes hand in hand with industrialization. Yeah. And the, you know, in France, I still am baffled by France at this point. They're so old school at this point. They think everything is about aristocracy and prestige and glamour. And it's like, they can't stop changing their figurehead. And I'm going on and on about it, but we'll see in the next podcast how bad that gets. And
okay, want to get to 1848 now?
Yeah, I think we've already jumped over it, unless you have something else to say about it.
We didn't really get down deep into it. So 1848 was a seminal year in European history, definitely in the 19th century. Like I said earlier, there were definitely movements. I mean, there was socialism, but the two biggest, that wasn't actually a huge factor in 1848. The two biggest ideologies were nationalist and basically liberal movements. Nationalism means kind of the idea of forming a nation state. You didn't just want it to be a state that belonged to the aristocracy. You wanted it to belong to an entire nation and kind of represent that nation. And then there was kind of liberalism, which is basically the ideas of the Enlightenment, which were also very influential in the 1848 revolutions. So one of the revolutions you had was in France, which is kind of like a second French Revolution. That was when Louis XVIII was overthrown, and there was a second French Republic, which Napoleon III would later become prominent in. There were also revolutions in Austria. They didn't overthrow, but they basically forced Metternich to resign because he could no longer basically hold this together. There were also it was mostly the immediate political impact is mostly a lot overblown in the 1848 revolutions, but the long term is basically like it basically signaled the beginning of the end for the old regimes in Europe.
Yeah, the old regimes were over, and then of course, you know, the Austrian Empire was in its last decades. It was going to change radically, reformulate, and it would basically become the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But we'll talk about that next time. All right, Evan.
Yeah.
You think that's good? Yeah, we got it all.
Yeah.
All right.
There were other 1848 revolutions, but I think France and Austria were the biggest. I mean, Britain wasn't really affected that much by it.
Yeah, and of course in Germany it's not unified at this point, so all the revolutions are going on there are these small principalities and Brandenburg, you know, duchies. Bavaria is a big one. I like Bavaria because you never really know who it's going to align with. Maybe it'll align with the French, maybe it'll align with the Austrians, maybe the rest of the Germans. You know, you never really know. It's a wild card, like the Swiss. Anyway, that's good, man. Thanks for stopping by. I'll wrap it up right now.